On 100.9 WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Good morning, everyone. On this Saturday, July 28th, you are listening to Evidence of Design here on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. Thank you for being here and listening. My name is Jason Taylor, and I'm joined today by my good friend and co-host, Matt Treadwell.
Good morning.
And also a very special guest this morning, my good friend, Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
We are talking today in our 18th episode of Evidence of Design about media literacy and propaganda. Perhaps this topic is one of the most important topics we can be talking about today in America and also around the globe. And for those of you new to Evidence of Design, we talk a lot about income and wealth inequality in America. We take a political economic approach on income and wealth inequality, and we try to ask and discover why we are living in a country with so much income and wealth inequality. You can find our past episodes on YouTube. Search Evidence of Design episode 1, 2, 3, or 4. Any of those will get you the hit. You can also, please do, give us a call throughout the hour, 585-219-8889. You can tweet us at Evidence Design 0. Going to totally overwhelm you here. You can also email us, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and participate in this discussion with you. So again, for the next hour, we're talking about media literacy and propaganda. Matt and I, we've covered that a little bit in the past, right? Media literacy?
Yeah.
Some of the topics, I think we were doing Cambridge Analytica and the evolving Facebook scandal with data privacy. And we brought up media literacy a lot in there, but there's a lot more. A little bit, yeah. You're right. There's so much more in depth we could go to it, and hopefully we're continuing to breach the surface today, talking about what media literacy is, what propaganda is, why all that is important, and what we can do to become more media literate citizens. So, folks, thanks a lot for joining us. Matt, you ready to take it away?
I'm ready.
Go for it. I'm wide awake, Matt. Who is that?
That was Parquet Courts.
Parquet Courts.
With their song Wide Awake off their latest album, Wide Awake.
Is it really stretched out like that?
It is.
I think they have a new album. I've been hearing them a lot on at least a few local radio stations. Is that true? They have a new album?
Yes, that is the new album.
Okay.
Just came out in end of May, I believe.
And what kind of, have they been around a while? What kind of music do they do?
They've been around since like 2012, I want to say. They yeah. So they're fairly new. Mm-hmm. But they have like 4 or 5 albums out. Just like 80s punk, and this new record has some funk influences, so it's pretty cool.
What's a parquet core?
It's it's a design, I believe, right?
Oh, I don't know. I'm asking you.
It's like because I know I looked it up at one point. It's like wooden, kind of like I can't think of like what's the word? Tessellations? I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, the shapes that fit into each other.
Yes.
Okay.
Nice.
Mary got me.
So we're listening to music. Do we need media literacy with music? What do you folks think? Is media literacy just something out there with fake news and all that? Or do we need to have media literacy with a song, for example?
In what context do you mean?
Well, we're going to be talking a lot today about Russian influence in the 2016 campaign. We're talking about social media and just really objectively fake news pushed on social media. We'll talk about disinformation, misinformation. Do we need to be critical consumers of media when we're listening to music, or can we just kind of say, I just like listening to music and I can enjoy this?
I mean, I think the burden of responsibility in being responsible as a consumer of like news media is much more important than it is for music. I mean, personally, I love to dissect and analyze music just because I am so passionate about it. But I don't begrudge anybody who just listens casually or even doesn't listen to music at all, because there are people out there who don't enjoy music.
Sure. Yeah. There's expressly political music out there, sort of propagandic music, thinking of the home fronts during war or something. Maybe, I don't know if the Star Spangled Banner, you could count that as, I'm not sure.
What's that one song they always teach you in high school? Over there, send the word over there, right. We'll be there.
Right, yeah, that's interesting. Well, maybe it'll help us in this discussion if we first define the things that we're talking about. So when we really talk about media literacy, it's a really broad topic. It's pretty inclusive, and really a definition you could use is media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. So that's from NAML, the National Association for Media Literacy Educators. Media literacy is very important in education, and for educators who are trying to figure out how to teach students about media literacy, that's kind of the association that really helps to promote media literacy education. So again, media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. So you're not just receiving the communication, you also have agency, you also have power to create said communication. So anytime you're dealing with any form of communication, whether it's me speaking to you right now, or looking on Facebook, Twitter, reading the news, right, even when you're doing anything, writing something, media literacy is involved. And it's really important because every single form of communication is socially constructed. Meaning we have the power as humans to create particular messages, and ultimately we have the power to determine how we interpret those messages. And has fundamental importance when it comes to really broad things such as democracy and truth. And we have to have the skills as a population to be able to figure out what messages are perhaps more truthworthy, trustworthy than others. Yeah, absolutely. More accurate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's also, however, disinformation and misinformation. So media literacy media can kind of be misused in some ways. And Mary, are you able to kind of articulate the difference between disinformation and misinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had to be very clear when I was talking about this with my students in the past year, because English was not their first language. So to clarify, disinformation is an intentional misleading. So it's like a news source saying, hey, we want our readers to think a certain way, so we're going to use certain words or certain pieces of information that are going to lead them in one direction. So disinformation is intentional misleading, where misinformation is something that could be like an honest mistake. So it's getting incorrect information, but not necessarily on purpose.
And you're an educator, Mary. At least you have background in education a little bit.
Yeah, like I guess you could call me an educator light. I just came back from 2 years of teaching English in Germany. So the first year was a Fulbright grant, and I worked in a high school in northern Germany, in the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And then the second year was just a grant through the government, but I was working in the same school with the same students, but they're all English language learners. I worked with grades 7 through 12.
Got it. And what were you teaching them?
A variety of things. So I was just working with different English classes. I was assigned sort of to one teacher who I had as a mentor. So I worked primarily with her classes, but I worked with other classes as well. So I would go they had block schedules. So I would go to each class usually once a week, sometimes every other week, depending on my schedule and their schedule. And I usually left the sort of grammar and English basics to the actual teacher, because that's not what my background is in. Obviously, I'm a native English speaker, so unfortunately my grammar is it's there, but I can't teach it yet. So I mostly touched on cultural topics or things that I was interested in. I actually was very grateful to have a lot of liberty in what I taught, and so I actually did teach I think a 4-week session on media, specifically to a 12th grade class. And we talked about media literacy and disinformation. That was kind of cool because my mentor teacher was just said, we're doing this section on media. I'm going to do certain parts that are in the book. Can you teach some stuff? And I was like, sure. And I decided, since, fake news is this huge buzzword, and even in Germany, they're like, oh, ha ha ha, fake news. And they think it's kind of funny, using this word, throwing it around, and they use it a lot, and they don't really know what it means. So I was like, well, the best thing I can do as an educator of English language learners is to give them tools to understand what fake news is, and when they're reading online, to be able to know when they are getting good information, or not even good information, but information that's accurate and that's as little, has as little bias as possible. So I did this 4-week section on media and propaganda and disinformation to give them the tools to be more informed online.
Wow. So you actually expressly taught media literacy to these students in Germany. It was like a unit. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
The unit was media, and then I made it the disinformation. Yeah. Because I thought that was most important right now.
Did your students have any particular questions, if you can remember? Like, what was their sort of response to learning about media literacy? Was it something that they were used to? Was it new to them? Because they were learning about media literacy in the context of learning English as well, if I'm correct. So did they think that media literacy was only something that had to do with learning English language, or is it in German culture and learning as well?
No, so absolutely not. Actually, this was one time where I sat down at the end of the 4 weeks, and I asked my students for feedback. And I have actually a stack of written feedback, because I wanted to know what they had taken away from it and what they hadn't known. And they all, there were a few students that were like, no, I knew all of this already. But some of them said, I knew all this already, but it was really great to have this new context. And we actually looked at articles and we tried to analyze them. My choice of articles was maybe a little bit too the English was just too hard for them. So in the future, I would use, if I was going to do examples, I would do simpler things. But most of them said either that they had learned something new and that they were really glad, or that it was something that was a refresher that they had learned in German class. So they weren't just seeing it in English class. It was something that they were seeing in text analysis in German.
Is there a fake news problem in Germany that's perhaps as widespread or as bad as it is here?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I can answer it fully. I am fluent in German, but unfortunately not to the level where I read news in German frequently. And I don't know. I was in the context of an English class, so I would have to ask some German friends about that.
Sure.
I think from what I have heard, and I attended a conference a few years ago where someone actually compared major news sources in the US and Russia and Germany, because she was able to actually read in all of the languages. And from that conference, the takeaway was that Germany still had some bias, but it was less than the US or Russia. So I would say there still is definitely bias, but I don't know if it's to the extent of the English speaking world. It is also there just aren't as many German speakers as English speakers.
Yeah, Mary, thank you very much. We're going to hear a lot more about you and teaching students about media literacy in just a moment. But your last point there reminded me of something where that, you're talking about various levels of bias in the news. And I think you were looking at newspapers or newspaper articles.
Yes, we were.
So that's like established media types of things. Let's keep defining some terms here, though, because fake news is oftentimes different than what's coming out from, let's say, like the New York Times or something. Yeah. So let's define terms a little bit more. We've said media literacy is essentially anything that it's inclusive of all things that has to do with communication. So you interpreting communication, you creating communication, that really is media literacy, just your ability to interpret and create forms of communication. Mary, you let us know that disinformation is the intentional confusing or distracting of people. So it's purposefully using forms of communication to confuse or distract others, whereas misinformation is unintentional. So it might just be inaccurate reporting because of breaking news is going on, so it's hard to get the accurate information.
I think Mary, you provided a great example when you said for disinformation would be like a news outlet intentionally publishing a piece that is misleading or has inaccurate information in an attempt to persuade its readers to a certain mindset. And I think maybe a good example of misinformation would be a reader who believes that information and shares it on social media and says, oh, look at what's happening. But they don't actually realize or understand that it's not accurate.
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
That's interesting how it kind of spreads throughout the body politic through social media, especially. Yeah, this is why this is so important, because there's different levels of intentionality going on, and as consumers, we have to kind of know where we fit into all of that as consumers of media. There's also two last things we should define, and one of them is propaganda. That's a very big piece of what we're talking about today, and propaganda, we can define in a number of different ways, but basically it's any information that's used to promote a particular point of view. It's oftentimes tied to extreme bias. So it's using information to promote a particular point of view. Maybe we'll get there. We have a philosophical discussion of propaganda and whether or not everything is propaganda. But for now, the way I think about propaganda is it's purposefully used extreme bias to get a point of view across. Oftentimes it's political, so political in nature. And lastly, let's talk about fake news. What is fake news? Because we're now living in a world where, of course, there are people who call anything that they disagree with personally fake news. That's not fake news, is it?
I would say no.
No. So what is fake news then?
I guess that's the question of the day, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was what I tried to work with my students. It's a buzzword that I think doesn't have a specific definition, so people are kind of just using it in a way that works for them right now. And like you just mentioned, some people are just saying, oh, it's stuff I don't agree with. I personally would call fake news news or news sources that are using disinformation, that are intentionally misleading, or even that are not doing their fact-checking themselves. So things without editors or like news bots, honestly. I mean, there are some online news in quotes, news articles that don't even have human writers, that they'll just take in a whole bunch of information and spread it out. And so making sure that there's actual humans who are writing is a first step in making sure that it's not fake news.
Yeah.
But I would say it's news that has been checked and checked and verified would be what is not fake news. So
absolutely.
Real news.
Yeah, I totally, fake news, it's intentional again, like disinformation. So there's an intentionality to it. And the point about fake news is that it's purposely created to look real. So it's meant to deceive people. So it is intentional false information that's produced to look real and make people believe in the falsity that's being produced. And Mary, you're right in that it's sort of a buzzword now, and I think that's unfortunate. I don't have any evidence of this or proof, but just being a sort of an in-depth consumer of news around the 2016 election, I remember when fake news, I hadn't heard of fake news 4 years ago.
Yeah, me neither.
The term,
right? had only heard of fake news around 2016, and I think, we could do a genealogy of the word to look back, but
Donald Trump would have you believe that he had coined the term.
That he coined the term, right. My first memory of fake news being used was by legitimate news sources, like the New York Times and other sources, but also from things like the Justice Department and the FBI, legitimate sources who were saying that there is objectively false stories being put out, fake news, designed to mislead the American public and help Donald Trump. And then very soon after, Donald Trump started to wield the term and call anything that disagreed with his point of view fake news. And now, so he's the one, not he particular, but like that thing has really made fake news kind of meaningless. And it's a brilliant strategy on his part to just turn it around, as he does all the time when anything ever disagrees with him. He just turns it around and says, no, I'm not fake news, you're fake news. And then it means nothing anymore,
I'm lying. No, you're lying.
You're lying, right.
We're all lying.
And then we have to have hours-long discussions on public radio about what fake news is, all because...
No, but I think you're really right to bring up the dual nature of it, because it has taken on sort of a life of its own as this mental shortcut for people to just dismiss anything that they disagree with.
Yeah.
Or don't want to look into. I think part of his laziness, to be honest, is that you don't want to, if you don't want to fact check something, it's like, no, it's just fake news, whatever. I don't need to fact check it.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we're going to get into more about different examples of fake news later on in the show. But folks, I want to remind you that if you're just tuning in, you are listening to Evidence of Design here on 100.9 FM WXIR. We'd love to hear from you throughout the show. Give us a call, 585-219-8889, or give us an email, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. You can also tweet us at evidencedesign0. We'd love to have you a part. We're talking about fake news and propaganda today. Now, Mary, if I can turn it back to you, you just came back from teaching in Germany for 2 years, and you led a media literacy unit with some of your students.
That's right.
Can you speak more about that unit? In particular, can you speak about what sorts of things were you trying to teach your students to become media literate citizens?
Sure. So I was working with a 12th grade class that I had also worked with for an entire year as 11th graders. So it's a class that I knew quite well, and I knew that their English was pretty decent and that they might be the kinds of students who would be looking online at different news sources in English even. I mean, they all read a whole bunch of things in German, but a lot of things aren't available in German. So I thought that this would be a class where a lot of students would be reading in English as well. So when my mentor teacher asked me to do this lesson on media literacy, or on media actually, and I decided to make it media literacy, I wanted to focus on very, very direct sources or direct strategies that the students could then use. And not only that they could use in English, but that they could use in any kind of reading. So whether they were reading in German or another foreign language, that they could use these same tools. So the first thing that we talked about, actually the first thing that we did was just talk about what media is. So again, these different kinds of communication, and I just asked them to imagine what their day, what 2 hours of their day looks like, what kind of media they use. And, they had lists of, I listen to the radio, I watch TV, I read books, I'm on social media, I'm doing all these different things just to take a look at how surrounded we are by media. And how much it affects our daily lives. So that was the very first thing. And then we talked about media bias and what that means. So having a side to, I don't know, help me out here.
Yeah.
With media bias.
It goes along with propaganda, I think, with that extreme bias. I mean, each media outlet has their own point of view or bias, and it's hard to perhaps get any
divest
truly
yourself of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible, right, as humans to not have bias. It's absolutely impossible. Yeah. At least I believe so.
I'm personally of the opinion that it's just best to be open about what your bias is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to define bias for the students, which is not it's a surprisingly difficult thing to do. And I think maybe because it's so inherent, I'm not sure, but we talked about bias and how like you guys both just said, that pretty much all media sources are going to have some sort of bias. So I guess some sort of point that they're trying to get across. And sometimes it's not something that they notice. But we obviously have whole ranges of different kinds of bias, and there's like very, very strong right or left leaning bias. And then there are some sources that are more central, but everyone has sort of a little bit, and every writer obviously puts a little bit of themselves into their writing.
Yeah.
So we talked about media bias, and then we talked about the ways to spot fake news.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
I'm ready to learn.
So really, if you like go into Google and you type in 5 ways to spot fake news, you'll get a whole ton of hits, and they're all great, and they all have slightly different techniques. So I have a list of, not quite my own, but taken from different sources. So I'm going to pretend it's my own fake news. Just kidding.
Your bias is showing.
Yeah, your bias.
Anyway, so some of these tips are, the very first 2 actually were some that are really hard for my students because they are not English native speakers. So the first one is straight up, does it seem legitimate? So when you look at the article, and I will say we were focusing mainly on news sources. So this was like print media or online articles. So we're looking, at things with a title and a few paragraphs of quote unquote information. So sometimes information, sometimes less than. So the first thing is like, look at the headline and does it seem legitimate? And if your answer is no, then just go into it knowing that it might not be legitimate or that you're going to want to check it further. So the first one is, does it seem legitimate? And then how does it make you feel? So like once you've read through the article, does it make you really angry or does it make you react? As if something is straight news that doesn't have a strong bias, it shouldn't really make you react unless the news that is unless the news itself is very upsetting. So for example, when, the many times that we've had school shootings, of course that information is going to make you react a certain way because the information itself is devastating. But there are different ways to report on that. And if the actual reporting is what's making you feel upset or really sad or really angry, that's another red flag. So you should make sure that it's not making you react because of the way it's being told. Yeah.
Got it. So there's sort of the substance and then the angle, perhaps.
Yeah.
So you can, what I'm hearing from you is that you can be sort of angry, sad, worried about the actual substance, like something as devastating as you said of a school shooting. But then there's the angle that could be wielding your emotions to make you react in ways that the author wants you to react.
And those, things that are already very upsetting are great times to make people think a certain way because they're already going to be vulnerable. So it's a time where maybe not an author, but maybe a news source would be like, okay, we can make our point here because we have sort of this almost a weapon of information that is already going to make our readers more vulnerable.
Wow, that's powerful.
That's what weapons are for. So the other ones are a little bit more based on the sort of makeup of the article. So first of all, make sure that there's an author. Like I said,
like a real person.
Yeah, no, seriously. Right. Sometimes there are articles and you can't find the author anywhere.
Absolutely.
And it's like, either this is a really badly set up website or it's not written by a person. So make sure that there's an author. And not only that, but go further and, click on or Google search the author's name if there's not a link that you can click to. Make sure that they're writing other articles and read some of those other articles and do the same sort of, do these articles seem legitimate? If you're noticing that their other articles are also very biased, then that's another red flag. So make sure that the author has credibility. Credibility might come from them being employed by a credible journal in the past or currently, or it might come from books that they've written or collaborations, but make sure that the author is credible. You also want to check for an editor because especially as we're in a very fast-paced environment of news where news is being published at an alarming rate almost, a lot of media is not edited for information. So no one else is fact checking, especially you mentioned breaking news earlier. I think that's what happens a lot is like, each news source just wants to get the information out as fast as they can. So they don't double check. And I think that can be forgiven in some cases, especially with, with breaking news, as long as you go back and say, hey, we made this mistake earlier. So if you make up for it, that's fine. Or sort of explain it later. But if you're just sort of getting your information out and never going back and double checking that it's accurate, that can be very problematic. So checking for an editing staff or an editor is also a really great key.
And I know, Mary, that article, at least the major news sources will post corrections on their articles.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're usually at the bottom of the article in like italicized font, and it'll tell you the date and almost even the time, I believe, of when the correction was made. And that at least tells you that there's an editing team there. There's no editing team on social media. No. We are the editors because we're the ones who are shouting down other people's articles if they're not legitimate.
Yeah. So, I didn't focus on social media as much, I will say that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I was hoping that they would take this away with them on social media anyway.
To bring it over.
Yeah. We'll see.
What other tips do we got?
So the last one that I have, which of course this is by no means the last tip, but was looking for different sources. So making sure that authors who use information list the sources that they get it from. So if they are on site, then that should be stated. And that's one point of credibility that they might have is that they are actually there and they might post a photo of themselves or whatever. But looking for, hey, we got, this piece of information from this source, and then not only having maybe the name, but, they might have the article linked, and then you can go and read the other article. So a lot of it actually has to do with like cross-checking your information. And so it's the same with editors, with authors, and with the sources is like going to a different spot on the internet and seeing if it's consistent. Because if it's inconsistent, that can be a danger sign.
So Mary, you just shared, 4 to 5 tips that individuals can use to determine if at least like major print media are sources of, or maybe using bias, and we want to be more critical consumers of said media. And you were talking about, well, look at the title first of all. Is the title outrageous? And that's actually a really important point because I don't know if this is the statistic, but there's at least a lot of people, myself included sometimes, who might share an article by just reading the title. I know if I read a title of something and I really want to share it with someone real quick because I'm like, yeah, this is important. This confirms what I'm doing. Have you done that too at all, or?
I've
read them.
I try to be very careful about that.
Yep.
I feel like I don't do that anymore. I might have done that in the past, but
same.
I definitely don't always go to the length of like looking for like what a writer has also written, or even if a topic is being written about by other people, which I think is important.
It's time consuming though.
It is, yeah.
It's also understandable though. So if you're not doing that, I think it's at least important to come in with, this might not be fully accurate and I need to make sure that I read other sources of similar material so that you can get more well-rounded. So you don't always have to do the whole, checking the author, checking everything in every single article that you read. That would be exhausting and you'd never sleep.
Right.
So going into it with the idea that this might not be fully accurate information, but I'm going to get what I can out of it is already a good step,
I think you bring up a great point, Mary, which is jumping off what you just said. We're living now in a world where the onus of responsibility of determining what is real is placed on the people who are consuming the media, not the people who are making it. And that's not really fair or right, I think. I think we should be, in an ideal world, we should be able to trust just whatever media outlets are printing or producing, but it's not necessarily the case right now.
Yeah. It's actually kind of funny. The only ones that you can really trust are the ones that are very biased.
Yeah.
Because you know
You
they're
know
biased
bias.
already.
Yeah.
Right. That's funny.
And it's like, okay, you can look at, or we'll say a Breitbart article, for example, and you know which way it's going to be leaning.
Mm-hmm.
And you can choose what you believe from it, but you can go through that and say like, okay, I'm going to pick out all the names that they're calling and all the, all the fluff, I guess, and you can pick out the information that is actually there.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really powerful point between both of you. And Matt, you brought up the idea that the onus is more and more on individuals. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about that a lot in the past about neoliberalism and how individuals increasingly are having to take, the burden on things that perhaps could be done by the government. But that's different. Like, we don't want a government in the United States that, of course, has to go through every source of information and censor it and all that. Like, we have a free press for a purpose, and we're proud of that as Americans, and that's part of sort of our identity. The problem, though, Matt, I think, is that with social media, so everything you were mentioning, Mary, had to do with sort of legitimate, quote, major print articles or whatnot. The problem is that with social media, we've removed the gatekeepers of information, so it's democratized it, which is good on one hand, because now we're all able to be our own journalists and fact checkers, but it's also bad because that's not our full-time job, and most of us don't have training in it, and also we don't go to the depth of needing to check this information. No one's going to fire us by promoting slanderous and misleading disinformation, right? And so that's the problem, where democracy in this aspect is both rewarding and liberating, and also potentially self-destructive. And I think that's the whole purpose of this conversation, where, okay, we're living in this world now, which is great. We have all these tools at our disposal, but Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility, right? And we really do have to think about that. So.
Yeah, we have to be responsible consumers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard.
It's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
So let's perhaps move into really debating about what constitutes fake news or even propaganda. And
I have another list for propaganda.
Oh, great. Let us delve into that in just 1 second. But
sure,
folks,
yeah.
100.9 FM WXIR, that's where you are tuning in. Thanks for listening here on our 18th episode of Evidence of Design. We are talking about media literacy and propaganda. Give us a call. We'd love to hear from you, 585-219-8889. Participate in this discussion. Are you worried about fake news? Are you worried about disinformation? Have you done any of the tips that Mary just mentioned? Do you try to be critical consumers of information? Are you worried about this?
Have you ever shared a news story that you later found out was inaccurate?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We definitely want to hear from you on this. So again, 585-219-8889. Matt, if we can, I wonder, Mary, you mentioned Breitbart, right?
I did, yeah.
So
I used one of those articles in my classes.
Yeah.
That was how I learned, actually, that my students' English was not where I thought it was, because they didn't get the bias. And that was one of those things where, like, it was an article that made me, like, cringe.
Wow.
Because they used so many propaganda techniques, which I will get into later. And the students absolutely didn't get it. They didn't know where the bias was. And so that was one thing where, as a native English speaker, I have so much more context than they do, and like what certain words, what weight certain words have that they don't have. So that, for me, that's why it was so particularly important to teach English language learners these steps, because some of them are harder for them. So they really need to do the cross-checking with articles, because they might not be able to depend on the how do you feel, or does this seem legitimate, because those are steps that their language doesn't allow them for yet.
Well, why don't we hear some of those steps on propaganda, Mary?
Sure.
What are some of those steps that you can teach to your students to kind of determine if something is propaganda? And I want to remind listeners that we kind of define propaganda at the start of the show as any information that's used to promote a particular point of view, and it's oftentimes heavily biased. It could be information that's fact, opinion, oftentimes disinformation, but it's oftentimes heavily biased.
Oftentimes when we use the word propaganda in our day-to-day going abouts, it usually has a negative connotation. We think about it being used in a perhaps an improper way. and hand in hand with disinformation or misinformation. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. It can just be somebody speaking from a biased perspective.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I would argue that those commercials that say how bad smoking cigarettes are, like, I would argue that's propaganda.
Right.
I don't think that's a bad thing. So, but of course, we're talking mainly here about propaganda that's used for nefarious activities. And I do wholly understand, listeners, that my definition of nefarious activities may differ than yours, but that's the point of living in a democracy, and that's where we have to talk about that.
Talk about it.
That's right. Let's talk about it. So, Mary, first, let's hear what are some strategies that folks can use to sort of be critical consumers of information such that you can combat propaganda.
Sure. So this is actually more of a list of techniques that are used in journalism and advertisement that you can look out for. So I don't have specific examples of them, but we can maybe look at a specific example in a little bit. So this is a list of 7. This is by no means all inclusive. Again, there are always more things that I like to list. So, but this is a list of 7 common techniques that you can look out for when you're reading news articles. And in news articles, these really don't have much of a place. So if you see a lot of them, you should know this is a very, very biased article and the news may not be accurate. So I'll just go through this list. Feel free to interrupt me.
What are these articles doing to use propaganda? Let me know.
Okay, so the first one is glittering generalities. And so that's using words like nice words that make people feel good. This is again with how does this article make you feel? So using words like goodness or patriotism or family are words that often have a connotation that makes you feel a certain way. And so it's just words of praise that make people feel good and sound nice.
I'm sorry, Donald Trump oftentimes uses a lot of, I don't know. I don't want to bring up Trump with everything. Superlatives, yeah. And also the whole idea.
We're doing very well. We're doing very well. And we're doing
very
well, actually.
Great.
And Matt and I, we've talked a lot before about our sort of bristling at the use of hardworking American families. Every politician ever uses that whenever they want to prove a point. Hardworking Americans
I just had a big eye roll that the listeners did not see, but I'm just going to
jobs,
and jobs. Yeah,
take care of our soldiers.
That's right. Sorry to interrupt you though, Mary, but that's I think that's a really powerful example, and I think that's really important too. How does this make you feel? That's not something I think about often when I read something, so that's news to me actually.
I think about it a lot now. But no, I said you're free to interrupt, so that's not being taken away. So feel free to interrupt. So the second one, so that was glittering generalities. And next one is name calling. So if an article is trash talking someone or saying bad things about another person, it probably also is propaganda that's making one person look good or one thing look good by trash talking another. So name calling, probably every third grader's favorite. Not to say anything bad about third graders.
Of course not.
The third one is testimonial. So that's often a famous person or someone who's well known who would be recommending a product. So if we're talking about advertisement, like you mentioned smoking, if there's a famous person who is, holding cigarettes that might make us want those, or on the other hand, who said like, hey, smoking is bad. It's someone that we know we can relate to. So that could be with a product or with a political endorsement. And so it's just someone who's well known saying, hey, this works for me. It could work for you too. On the other side of that, we have plain folks. So this is an appeal to quote unquote regular people. Like, like Everyday Joe or
hardworking American families.
Yeah, hardworking American families. Yeah. So words that are trying to appeal to people with talking about health or family or patriotism again. So things that might be appealing to the regular hardworking American or person from whatever nation that we're talking about.
I think we see this just on TV ads all the time where, commercials will make a point of saying, this is not a paid actor.
Yeah.
Do they have to do that though?
Are they even telling the truth half the time?
That's true. Yeah, like Geico uses that a lot. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
I'm not sure if they're allowed to say that if it's not true.
Right.
But I don't know who makes the rules.
That's a really interesting thing to look into. Yeah. Who makes the rules? Oh my God, there's so much to talk about with this. Jeez, yeah.
It's okay. If you want me to come back in another week, we can just continue.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah. All right. What else? What other techniques do sources or people use for propaganda, Mary?
Sure. So I have 3 more. And the next one is bandwagon. So, we talk about hopping on the bandwagon. So that's just an appeal to be part of a group. So when you're like, hey, everyone's doing this thing, you should do it too. It's bandwagon. So that can be politically, it can be with a product. Again, these are things that are really commonly used in advertisement.
Yep.
So not just in journalism. They're things that we can look for in journalism, but I honestly, it's really hard to walk around and see all the billboards and be like, oh, well,
Yep.
that's, these are all the things that they're using. And sometimes it's overwhelming, but it's good to be informed. So, last 2 I have, number 6 is transfer. And so that's something that helps a person imagine themselves as part of a picture. I don't know that I have a really good example for this one, unfortunately, but, just sort of, talking about seeing yourself in a different situation. So, you could talk about a hypothetical situation. Where imagine if this were this way, then
That's kind of make America great again, right?
I actually have an example I think that
cool.
would fit for this, which is I've been seeing this ad lately for more easily transportable oxygen canisters for people. They're I don't remember what the actual name of the product is called, but it's just this little rectangular box that can sit on your waist, and it seems much more easy to transport than say a huge tank.
Yeah.
And the ad for it will just show this older woman who's chosen to use the canister, and she's also friends with this other older woman who still has her tank, and they just make a point of showing how much easier the woman who has chosen to purchase the canister is having in her everyday life.
Yeah, that's a great example, actually.
And Mary, everything that you're saying absolutely has to do with propaganda, and I just want to remind with advertising. And I want to remind listeners that there's incentives for companies to use all of these strategies that you're using. And again, this goes into our sort of critique of the political economy, but there's a economic incentive to advertising and fake news. And we saw in the 2016 election that there were individuals in Eastern Europe who were publishing fake news articles, promoting fake news articles, not because they wanted to destroy democracy in America, but because it was making them money. They were teenagers and young adults in Eastern Europe in particular. I'm only saying this because that's what I know was released by reports of the 2016 election. I'm not slander, having a slander on Eastern Europeans or anything. I'm just saying that those individuals were using fake news to make money. It was their job. That's what they were doing. It wasn't like they had a larger political objective. Some of them might have. However, fake news also does have a political objective. And that's where you get into Russian interference in the 2016 campaign. So we have to be really, really critical about all of this because there's economic incentives, there's political incentives, and you're right that it's hard as individual people again because it comes really overwhelming to look at all forms of media and have to always be turned on, so to speak, to recognize when those strategies are being used. But I think there's one more a technique of propaganda.
Yes. So one more on my list. Again, this is not by no means all-inclusive. So the last one I have is card stacking, which is, fancy name. It means when you manipulate information to make a product or, again, something political to appear better than it is. And usually that's by just leaving out the bad parts. So card stacking is really just only talking about the good things. So it's making something look better than it actually is.
I think of the Marlboro Man.
Yeah.
How so?
He's like that perfect encapsulation of American masculinity, and he's tall and rugged and good looking and independent.
I don't even know who that is. I'm so.
Marlboro's a brand of cigarettes.
Cigarettes.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's a cowboy.
Yeah.
Actually, I think like 4 of the people who have portrayed him over the years have actually died from smoking related causes. So great.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
But so.
Although smoking advertisements do actually always have to include these sort of.
They do today. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they do today. So this is kind of a difference that we can see where. Where society has said, hey, no, we need all of the information. So I would say actually that's an example of one being changed so that it can't be card stacking. So you can't just show the good sides of smoking anymore. Now you have to say, and people can disregard that information, which obviously a lot of people do, but you can be like, hey, look at this cool person who's doing this cool thing while they're smoking. Also, this is going to make you die. Like this might give you lung cancer, or like this is related to all these different diseases. So they do have to put a more well-rounded thing legally, but not everyone has to do that. So that's a pretty rare case, I think, where you have to have the whole picture.
Yeah.
That's a great example where the government has actually stepped in to regulate some aspects of the media environment, whereas the vast majority of the media environment is a free, open, and unfettered market. And so that's where you have things like cigarettes, which it took decades.
Oh, yeah. It is the exception.
Yeah. It took decades of people getting lung cancer and dying because the company purposely was telling people that smoking's cool and
that doctors recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good for you.
Yeah, it's disgusting, and it took
along
decades.
with your weekly bleeding.
Right. Yeah, it's horrible, and also the nutrition or food companies did that with sugar, where they were sort of misinforming people about sugar. And how, and now, so my point is now even with nutrition, like we have nutrition labels and whatnot, and there's talks right now of, added sugars. Of course, added sugar I think has to be on nutrition labels now. I don't know if it's a federal thing or a state thing, but those are examples where the government has stepped in because of decades of societal pressure to say, look, we don't need an open and free market on this. You need to be more honest with consumers about these sorts of things. And I think those are worthy pointing out. But the game has completely changed because now we have social media, less gatekeepers, and especially after 2016 where we saw that threats to democracy are very real, now we're literally in the midst of what do we do about it?
Maybe it's not that we have less gatekeepers, we just have so many more people who are unfeathered and unedited.
I think honestly, even just the enormous vastness of information available is sometimes overwhelming enough that it doesn't matter, or it matters less whether you're reading tons of good information, because sometimes it's just too much information to comprehend or to work with. So just like, even just being like, there's just so much that it's hard to know what's good and what's not.
Yeah.
It just makes you feel sort of helpless because there's so much going on.
Definitely. I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the responsibility placed on consumers and media to be responsible in the media that they consume. But when there's just so much out there being offered, and when people, as you said, Jason, aren't being paid to do this and they have other responsibilities, other jobs, and family members to take care of, it's ridiculous almost to expect them to be hyper vigilant all the time.
Yeah.
So we have a lot more to talk about media literacy, and we were going to go into questioning whether or not, for example, Fox News is an example of just blatant propaganda. I think for our remaining very few minutes here, Matt, I'm really curious about a question that you had raised to me throughout the week, and you were asking if our show is propaganda.
Well, I think a better way to phrase this, because if we're going by the definition that you provided earlier in the show, then literally every news source is propaganda.
Right.
And not to say that this is necessarily a news source, this show, but we do talk about the news on here. And I would say that we are propaganda. But what are ways in which our, I guess, methodology is different from something like Fox News?
We're asking people to question. I'm not even on the show. I'm already saying we.
You are a honorary member. You are welcome anytime.
Mary, you're hired.
Please. I need a break.
Matt needs vacation.
From his 1 hour a week on the radio.
A lot of work.
No, but I think it's important to ask people to question things, and I think that's what the show is doing, is asking people to question where straight or things that we might consider to be more propagandic are asking you, are telling you rather. They're not talking about the news. They're telling you what happened with a strong bias. And it's like, there's not the same room to question that. So sure, it can be propaganda, but I think being like, hey, this is our opinion is already saying, don't hold us liable or whatever.
Yeah.
Don't blame me.
Think your own thoughts. And if you disagree with us, then call in.
Right. Call us.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, Jason, you and I have always made an effort to be very clear about what it is we actually believe, and that viewer or listeners are free to disagree with what that is. Mm-hmm. I think one of the sort of, I don't know if it's right to call it dishonest, but perhaps misleading practices that Fox News has is that it employs a lot of people who are essentially just political commentators, people who are paid to share their opinion, but they're presented in a way in which they seem to be just reporting on the news. Mm-hmm. And if Fox News is the main source, or perhaps even the only source of news that you receive, then it can very easily be difficult to tell what is opinion and what is actual reporting.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. I was actually I was in the Greyhound station last week or 2 weeks ago, and while I was waiting for the bus, I was just looking at the screen, which specifically says you can't change the channel, and it was on Fox News, and I hadn't watched Fox News in years. I don't even own a television, actually, mm-hmm. So I don't really see it other than clips on social media, actually. Right. Which I usually scroll past because I don't want to, I don't want to get my information from 3-minute clips on the internet. Mm. So I was looking at this, and it was just people talking about their thoughts. And I was like, how is this even called a news station? It's fine to have that kind of stuff on TV. You can talk about your opinion. Sure. But to call it news is, I think, actually disinformation. Because it is saying, this is fact when it is absolutely not fact. Mm. Sure, you might be reporting on something that happened, but news should end with that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then go into an opinion piece if you want to talk about your opinion. But they don't seem to have that separation.
That's a really strong point. And I think we are definitely going to need to have more discussions about media literacy in the future.
This was a great introduction, though.
Yeah, I hope you listeners out there, you enjoyed it. I guess we can leave by saying, it's impossible to become super critical consumers of everything. I think, Matt, you said it earlier, just be aware, and you too, Mary, just be aware that everything is biased. Just be aware that you're biased, and just try to come at things at least with a critical mind of what it is that you're reading, and an open mind for other possibilities. So not just what the person is telling you. You can employ a number of the strategies Mary was talking about, look at the title, look for an author, think about how the article is trying to make you feel, check out if there's other articles written by a particular author, try to check out different sources. That last one is really particular when it comes to social media, when things are very unfettered and super bite-sized. Folks, we'll have to continue this discussion in the future. If you want to communicate with us throughout the week, you can email us, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. You can tweet us at evidencedesign0. Send us some of your questions, thoughts, concerns about media literacy. It is perhaps one of the most important topics we can be talking about today, along with income and wealth inequality. Those are my opinions, and perhaps you share them, perhaps you don't. But I really want to thank you all for listening today. I was joined by my good friend and co-host